All right, we're live, and I should probably hit this tweet button. There we go. Sweet. Welcome to Sass Bites, where I get my order mixed up of which button to press first. This is your weekly bite of Sass during your lunch break. We are continuing in a series on front-end architecture. We've been doing this for the last several weeks, and I think we've actually got a good bit of steam. We're going to keep doing it for a while because there's so many amazing people out there. I'm really excited to talk to get in and discuss what they're specialized at or what they bring to the table. We've talked a lot about the pillars of front-end architecture of the code, the documentation, the testing, the process, or the automation. And today I'm really excited to bring someone that's really, really deep into the code portion of it, of like how can you build lasting code? How can you build a project that's going to be around for years? It's not going to turn into a big pile of spaghetti mess 6 months after you leave the project. So really like to try and bring in those experts, and today is certainly no exception of that. Our guest today is a technology writer and web developer living out in Cheshire, UK. So everyone can just enjoy the accent. It's going to be great.
I'm super excited.
He's a senior front-end dev at Bet365, and he's got a previous life as a freelance writer, actor, and screenwriter. We definitely want to hear about some of those things. So Ben Frain, appreciate you coming on the show. Why don't you say hello?
Hello, everybody. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Can you say something extremely British for us, just like over the top?
Talk about tea
and scones, yeah. That's the obvious one. Do you have scones over there?
I do, but I think we'd be in an argument as to what a scone actually is.
Oh, okay.
What's a scone? Tell us what a real scone is.
A real scone is you would get them in Cornwall, which is right down the sort of southern tip of the UK. And it's kind of like, it's a bit hard to describe. A scone's a scone. I need to send you some.
How thick is a scone? Is it about like an inch thick, or?
About so thick, and
Okay,
you'd have it cut in half, and then you'd have jam on and loads of clotted cream.
That sounds like a heart attack waiting to happen. I'd like to have one.
That sounds delicious, and I'm hungry, and I really want that.
Well, now that we made everyone out there hungry, let's dive into this. We've got a ton to talk about today because I was going through some of the articles of yours I want to talk about, and I kept on finding more I was wanting to bring up. So we've got a bunch we can dive into. The first thing, though, I like to ask all the guests in here is when did you first come to the realization that I'm an architect, or at least I do more architectural stuff than I do actual code writing? What brought you to that point, and what was that realization for you?
I think for me, most of the things that I write about and the things that I end up sort of doing are purely for selfish reasons. It's because I find myself in a situation where things are becoming more difficult than I would like. And so I suppose for me, it's sort of the change in mindset came about when I had to own a project for a long period of time. So it wasn't just about client work where you'd build something, you'd get it looking okay on the screen, pass it over to somebody, and then you'd be on to another job. It was when I had to sort of think, I'm going to be working on this same thing indefinitely. And I want my life to be easier, never mind the other people that I've got to come on and explain this to. And so I think you get to a point where it's not enough just to get something working and be able to give it to somebody. I found I had to get to a point where I could explain what every single line of code did and why it was there, and there was no magic numbers, there was no sort of hacks that I just copy and pasted from somewhere and slapped in and went, well, that makes it all work and that's great. I suppose it was really that. I'd never really given it a title in that way, but the more I think about it, that sort of is what it is. It's trying to figure out how to make these things workable for an indefinite period of time, or for as long as you'd want it to, rather than you getting to a point where you bash up against the edge and you go, this is just such a mess, I need to start again. I hate coming to that point, and so a lot of the sort of processes that I've tried to figure out of late are to negate that happening.
Yeah, it's one of those code conundrums where the best pull request is where you're yanking code out and not pouring a bunch of code in. Yet with CSS, that never seems to be possible. I mean, it's so impossible to yank code out because we don't have those systems in place to be able to properly know it's not going to break everything down for us. So, so the first thing we were going to talk about, probably the article I think that brought me to reading your work first was that of Enduring CSS. And seriously, this could have been a book. This would have been a great book I would have bought. It's a huge article. We'll certainly link all these on Twitter here shortly afterwards. But what brought you to the article, and we can talk a little bit about some of those key points right in there.
So I've been working more or less on the same project, or the same sort of basic aim, for the last sort of year and a half, and it's gone through many iterations, and by doing that I've tried a lot of the different sort of common approaches to writing and scaling CSS that you read about. So the whole SMAX, OCSS, I've tried all these different things, and they've never quite fit, or there was always trade-offs, so they'd solve some problems, but then others would remain, or different problems that I hadn't considered came to the fore. And so it was a case of the more you do stuff, obviously, the more confident you get with it. And eventually I got to a point where, even though some of the conclusions I was coming to myself would be against the grain of what the majority of sort of common thinking would tell you, I could see the results for myself because I could measure it, and I knew, because the proof was in front of me, that it was a better way of doing it for me. And so I basically just steal the best ideas that I come across from everybody. And so some of it was like genuine, just I'd figured out and decided that this was the best approach. And then other things were like little snippets. Like I remember seeing Nicholas from Twitter, Nicholas Gallagher, he did a talk where he mentioned this thing about splitting up technology. So rather than having your HTML folder, your CSS folder, your JS folder, and all the different things that way, it was broken into like, well, what's the thing that I'm building? It's a shopping cart. So inside shopping cart are the three: the JS, the HTML, and the CSS. And it was one of those things that clicked, and thought, I'm definitely having that because I know that will make my life a lot easier. And
that's a concept we've been talking about. We've talked about it a couple times in the show. That kind of like web components-esque. How do you group things? And kind of going away from that, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and actually kind of putting everything together. And I think there's some interesting technology questions to still be solved around that. Like, how do you deliver that? Can you deliver a little chunk of HTML and CSS only whenever that module is there? What does that do to your, to your HTTP requests, or your page speed, or rendering order and stuff like that? So I think that I'm really curious to kind of see where that's going.
Yeah, I mean, my sort of, again, I'm sort of selfish because I'm just looking at it from my point of view. But I tend to have a build process. Well, there's two things going on. Sometimes I'm doing includes, so some of those like little stubs are just includes that will get built out into a bigger template that will never change. And then there's other components which are being pulled in via JavaScript. So in certain instances, or when a page is Ajaxed in, that's when it goes and grabs that template and fills it out. So whilst the CSS is there waiting for it, this sort of stub gets Ajaxed in and puts the markup there, which then the CSS applies to. Yeah, so I've not done stuff specifically with components, but I could say with hand on heart, this way of like grouping stuff by components has made things immeasurably simpler for me. And purely from the CSS point of view, like the way that I do stuff now. Because I can grab these entire components, and when I need to sort of deprecate an entire component or build a new version of it, it's literally as easy as like you right-click on the folder and delete, and it's gone. And you've got it there in Git if you need to go back to it, but you can then just make a new one. And by virtue of the fact that you can just cut these enormous lumps out, it keeps your code base. For me, it's far smaller than it ever was doing the OOCSS or the SMAX or any of the other things. And that's not because there's things that are inherently wrong with those approaches. They just don't suit what I'm doing.
Yeah, so one of the big things that kind of struck me with that article, and some of it resonated, I think is the best way to say it, was the idea of manageable CSS over like the most 100% lean, smallest file size CSS. We spend so much time trying to abstract everything out to be the smallest file possible, and, using all these combination classes to make something happen, a button with this class and this class and this class to get the final thing, but we lose that manageability. So that was one of the biggest arguments I think you made that really struck for me, is that like we can give up a little bit of this. We can. It's okay to add a little bit of bloat, knowing that it makes our code more manageable, because it's typically that unmanageable code that leads to bloat down the road as you try to
totally. Mike and I talked about this when we started this series, and I gave a little talk on architecture at the Mixin in San Francisco, and I swear I pulled like 75% of my notes and like my blog post and my talk like from that article that you wrote, just like so much of it, because I'm reading it just going, oh man, like this is what we've been talking about. This is what I have been meaning to write about and never do because I never blog. So
you don't need to.
Well, that's great. I mean, it's funny because you write these things, and most of the time you put a blog post out and you don't really think much about it. But I can remember that was one of the few blog posts where I got a couple of people to look at it and go, I think a lot of people are going to really react negatively to this, and I fully expected that.
Negatively, really?
Yeah, well, because like at the time there was nobody saying this is a good thing, or I hadn't read anything where people were saying, yeah, it's fine to have a bit of extra code because you get it back this other way, and I felt like I had the conviction that I felt it was right, but that's different than sort of being 100% confident that people aren't just going to go, you're an idiot, People
yelling at you on Twitter, whatever.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I mean, I think you've only got to look at asset, like when you go to sort of HTTP archive or something like that, and you look up the makeup. Well, pick any site in the world, and if you just do the network requests and the dev tools, the CSS, it's never the biggest thing, or if it is, it's because it's loaded with data URIs, and so
or Bootstrap.
Yeah, so we're talking like an extra 5K maybe, and it's just not even, in the grand scheme of things. I'm as guilty, I want to get the leanest possible CSS as well, but I found I get that by virtue of the fact that I can cut these massive chunks out that otherwise I'd be too worried to remove, and that's the difference. You haven't got to just look at it about day one when you've written it that way. It's in 12 months' time, what state is your CSS in then? 2 years' time, what state is it in? So it's about those sorts of problems.
Yeah, and it's huge to be able to go in definitively and say, oh, this is old, we've deprecated this feature or whatever, and just remove all of it. That was another huge point from that article that I loved, because so much of the time it's, I don't know what this is, I guess I'll just leave it in.
And because it is fairly small, you just sort of go, it'll be all right, I'll overwrite it if I need to, and I think it's okay.
Yeah, but then later, and there's that cruft, that's the buildup, and there's so much of that. I see that so often. Even in some of the new stuff that we're doing right now, there's things that, as the designs have changed a little bit before we finally kind of solidified it, there's little bits and pieces in there that, have a note that like, oh, if this part didn't work, if we do this other thing, this can be removed, but it's not removed. And I'm just like, okay, we're like launching new stuff, new designs with this already in it. And I'm like, No. You have to be able to keep that stuff organized and to be able to pull it out. So.
And it works. It's not just that way as well. It's the fact that if some new design treatment comes in, I want the ability to build it very quickly without worrying that I'm going to pollute something I've already made. And that was always a problem that I had with this way of like really trying to build upon abstracted classes and things that do certain things. Is that you're often going in a slightly different direction, and you find that you need to change this thing that's actually shared, and then you're like, well, that's not shared anymore, that's something else, and so you're continually sort of tripping yourself up. Whereas, if you do it in a kind of in a namespace way, you're absolutely free to just build exactly what you need for that thing. So again, it swings and roundabouts, as we say, but yeah, I'm all for it.
Now, what I usually say is that, kind of getting back to what Elise just said, of technical debt begets technical debt, and if you let it start building up, if you've got that CSS that's left over, you basically have to create more technical debt to overcome that, and more and more and more. So yeah, if we can get to a point where like every time we're writing CSS, we're getting a leaner and meaner CSS, even if it's a little bit larger when we first build it, over time we're gonna have a much better setup. Now, I know one of the things that you mentioned in that article, and you touch on a few other as well, that we should probably hit on real quick, is your fun naming convention. And it's the best naming convention because it's the funnest naming convention. So how did you come to this? And give us a little background of what it is.
Yeah, well, again, it was sort of this whole odyssey that I've been on, where I've kind of, I've got names for things now, and a sort of a very solid idea in my mind of exactly what it is and what it does. But earlier on, I was still sort of feeling my way around things, and one of the biggest wins that I found was just to have a common naming convention that made some sense, and the fact that I could look at a class in 3 months' time and get a feel for exactly what it did, without it sort of being completely abstract and trying to piece together the bits in my mind. So, like that for me is one of the biggest wins in terms of CSS architecture, is just to figure out and document and stick to a naming convention for how you name things. And so, like I would say to people, you don't have to use fun. You just have to pick something that works for you, that you understand exactly why it does what it does, and then stick to it and enforce it. So, for me, I tend to use either a 2 or 3 letter namespace. That's quite key, because I like to namespace everything to prevent collisions with other things. And then I get a component name, which is upper camel cased, and then sometimes that's enough. But then occasionally, like say for example, a shopping cart, and the wrapper for that shopping cart would be SC for shopping cart dash uppercase cart, for example, then underscore capital W wrapper, and that's the component section. So you can very easily, like, it's not unlike something like BEM, and I've certainly looked at that heavily and modified it and tried different things. And again, Nicholas Gallagher, I know he's got Suit CSS, which has its own sort of convention, but I tend to favour this namespacing at the beginning, because it lets me very easily just segregate whole lumps of code and elements of code. And I've found that absolutely, it's been fantastic. I've got nothing negative to say about that, having used it for some time now.
Yeah,
Now, how
no
about
matter whatever you pick, it's kind of like the rules of them I see in like Fun and BEM, and all of them are kind of like this global to specific, the general to very specific. And the thing that I like about like Fun and BEM and some of them is being very verbose in your class names. Sometimes they can be kind of long to write, and so if you're doing them like in your HTML all the time, but for a lot of those, they're parents, they're wrappers. You actually don't, especially with Sass, have to redo that over and over, and so I think it's so much better to have long, kind of detailed.
Well, the thing is, I mean, like your gzip gobbles that sort of stuff up anyway. The repetition is just not even something we should
Oh, I
consider
just meant
ourselves
writing it, like the hassle of writing a really long class name over and over. But like with Sass, if you're trying to nest it, if you need to write it over and over, I mean, there's so much technology now that you don't even have to do that. So I find that like that's not even a good argument to keep them short and like.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think even your
I don't
text editors will autocomplete, won't they? A lot of them on a class name. I know Sublime does for me, and Vim does when I was using Vim. You type the first few letters and it pops up, and you're away at the races.
Yeah, I use the like you do the parent name up the top, and then you do the bracket ampersand dash whatever you want, and just the entire component is just ampersand dash, and it's super clean. And yeah, it makes for slightly more HTML, which is fine. You typically have a CMS that crunches HTML like nothing else. So once those get copied and pasted in, it's like, well, what's a couple extra letters? Because the benefits of it. I know for me, one of the things about this namespace is it allows you to do the N is the namespace. It allows you to do the F in Fun, which is being able to do a flat hierarchy. Can you talk a little bit about that and why you came to that?
Yeah, I mean, that was something I stole, basically, or, I remember reading, there was a couple of things knocking around, but probably the person that made it most obvious in everybody's consciousness was Harry Roberts. Had done a few blog posts about taking all your IDs out of classes, and only relying on class names for selectors and stuff like that. And I can remember at the time being a bit like, oh, that's ridiculous. And then obviously the more I tried it and used it on a couple of things, I was like, there's definitely something to this. So there's a couple of things. There's just in terms of your naming convention, I don't nest anything in Sass as well. I try and avoid that where possible. The only time I do that is for kind of state situations, where it's being hovered or something like that. And so that keeps you a very, very flat hierarchy, and it also means that when it comes to your build tools, you don't have to be too concerned about the order that your partials all get mashed together. You know, you can just glob them all in, and they'll all stick together, and nothing will interfere with anything else. So that's, you know, that's a big win, basically, having a very flat hierarchy of stuff, and then not using the context of something to change it. You know, so just because something's in a sidebar, like in my world, if I had something like a shopping cart, we'll go back to the shopping cart example. If I had a main page shopping cart and then I wanted to use another shopping cart but in the sidebar, if it needed to look different in the sidebar, it wouldn't be the same shopping cart. It'd be a different component. You know, so you'd still pull the same information into it, but it would be something else. So you get that divergence, which I don't concern myself with, but when you first look at it, you think, well, that's a bit daft. You know, it's really similar, but similar isn't the same as the same.
Yeah, and it might be similar today, but 3 months down the road, where they're like, oh, we need to make lots of changes to one of them, but not to the other one, then you have that ability to specifically target one over the other.
Yes.
So let's get to the middle of this then. Then your utility classes. I know the U is for utility. So how do you use those to make your system work?
They're probably the least sort of important part of it for me, and I've found that the more time has gone on, the less I'm finding utility and utility classes. So it would typically be like an easy example is like a W100 would be width 100. So if you want something, you want it to be the full size of its context, you'd stick that on. But I just find that more and more as time goes on, they can trip you up. So the things to sort of slap on things if you need to, but I like I say, I tend to not use them as much now. But I would then have a very ugly looking naming convention, because it would be the thin naming convention, which doesn't work as well. So I've got to keep them in there now forever.
You're stuck with the U.
Yeah.
Now one thing that's kind of interesting, I really love this one because it really has helped me out with what I'm currently developing. Because to be 100% honest, I'm using some star selectors, and I'm completely okay with that because it enables some amazing things. So you wrote a pretty extensive blog post with lots of examples and some research and some follow-up from I think some Chrome devs talking about selective performance. How did that come about, and what were some of the interesting finds?
Yeah, so this started, I think it was sort of around this time a year ago, off the top of my head. Some quick back and forth with some other devs at work. It was basically an argument about what selector to use and whether it was a good performing selector or not. And for some time I'd harboured this internal feeling that to worry about the selectors in CSS was utter nonsense or wasn't worthwhile. But the more I searched to try and get any real empirical evidence, I couldn't find anything. And so I thought, well, what's the worst that can happen? I'll make a complete idiot out of myself, but at least then somebody will be able to point out the truth, because the last thing that I could find on it was Steve Sauder's work at Google, which was in one of his high performance books, and it was about 2009. So this was like 3 or 4 years later, and these things are always a moving target. And so yeah, it was just sort of my own infantile attempt to try and figure out what was true, whether it was true or not from my own point of view. And obviously, the more I did and the more that I tested, the more I realised that, thankfully, for once in my life, I was right, and it was, it was pointless to worry about. And then, what was interesting about it is, as it got, it was relatively popular and people were talking about it. And then a guy got in touch who works on WebKit, and it's all in the post, but he effectively said, look, I don't necessarily agree with the way that you've run the tests, but the conclusion is still absolutely valid. So I still keep meaning to go back and try and get in touch with Firefox and Microsoft, people on the dev teams there, just to get their input, for a more rounded bit of feedback. But yeah, the upshot was basically, don't worry about selectors, it's nonsense, just use whatever you need to use. It's still, I still think the safest thing to do is just to use a flat class, because you're never going to get any trouble anyway using that. But yeah, I love star selectors. I'm all over them.
Yeah, I find them really interesting as we start getting really modular because oftentimes you'll want to impose styles on the children of something, and instead of putting classes onto the children or trying to style that specific use case or something, stars allow you to basically say like, especially caret star, like all the children of this, I want to do something.
I see. I don't do that. I used to do that.
Oh, I still love it.
Yeah, I sort of got to. I can't remember exactly, but I got to a point where I was like, I kept tripping myself up with that. And so yeah, I basically got to the point now where I just accept that although it's ludicrous, even if I'm putting a span in something just for a tiny little string of text, I'll still put a class on it.
Oh well, in this case, it's more of it's specifically for layout, and because I agree, I wouldn't impart like any font styles or anything like that. But it's like if you've got this div and you want to throw three elements in it,
Right.
you want those three elements to be a certain
33
layout,
a third or whatever. Yeah.
yeah, then I don't have to specifically style those three elements. I don't have to put classes on those three elements. I can just say, hey, container, like your children, lay them out this way, and without a star class. I mean, I could do div. But then what happens when you want to throw an article in there or something like that? It's been huge to be able to do that, and it's nice to have a little bit of, hey, here's a popular blog article that backs me up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is, like, I'd be more than happy to be proved wrong, but somebody's got to bring some evidence to the table, and then that's what we're lacking. So I sometimes do these things, if only to provoke people smarter than me to wade in and give me some facts to back up my assumptions. I'm totally over like being wrong about stuff. I think that's sort of one of the best things that I did along the way was get to a point where I just thought it doesn't even matter. If I write stuff which is nonsense, and I regularly go back to stuff that I've written and think, yeah, that's nonsense. But it's just a progression. You're just continually trying to learn stuff.
So one that could definitely maybe come off as nonsense, though I loved it, was this is probably the most recent one, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about because it's in the show notes, is OOCS as an anti-pattern. And again, how did you come to this? And especially curious what the response was to this. Personally, I love it and some of the points you hit. And yeah, just curious how this whole thing played out.
Well, it was great because somebody who I respect an enormous amount is Thierry Koblenz, who's he's a CSSer at Yahoo, and he's the guy who sort of figured out how to do intrinsic ratios on video and things like that. Super smart guy, and they've been doing at Yahoo a thing called Atomic CSS, which was funny because when he wrote about it on Smashing Magazine, I'd just come to the end internally of trying the same thing about 3 months before. And I'd got to a point with it where I decided it was a ludicrous notion, and I never wanted to do it again. And so it was interesting reading that because, I know for a fact they're no mugs, they're super smart people. But yeah, so that was one of the things that I'd done with. And then as I came back to it, it was basically, it's back to this same thing I keep encountering, which is like you need to understand what your problems are. And sometimes we choose these things because we think it's what other people are doing or what we should be doing, and we don't take the time to really stop and understand what the problems are that we're trying to figure out. And I think for me, that was the difference. Like once I really understood what my main problems were and what I needed to solve, I was a lot more comfortable with the solutions that I had because I knew that they fixed those problems. So the OOCSS thing, like for me, OOCSS like dates back to like 2009, 2010. There was no responsive web design then, and so a lot of these things about abstracting to classes, they just fall apart for me when you've got a thing that needs to behave very differently in different contexts. So it was basically about like I myself had struggled when I've been doing things the OOCSS way of like, well, how do I rationalize this thing that does a certain thing at one point and it's got a certain name, and then all of a sudden it's something completely different. And I know you could then use JavaScript to put different classes on and stuff like that, but that just seemed really counterintuitive to me. Like I always feel that you should always step up the difficulty. So first of all, you solve what you can with HTML, then you solve what you can with CSS, and only if you can't do it there, you move into JavaScript and server side. And so it was really just rallying against that because or not even rallying against it. Like I have nothing against it. I just feel like that there's not enough airtime given to the possibility that there might be alternative ways of solving similar problems that are equally valid. And so it was just trying to demonstrate, like, look, if you're trying to do this thing, which is the thing that I was trying to do, I don't think OOCSS is the best thing. I think it's an anti-pattern in this situation. You know, if you've got a complicated responsive web design, I don't think an OOCSS approach is the best option for you.
Yeah, one of the lines I loved from there, just to pick out real quick, was, "Why can't the thing just be the thing?" And I'm assuming you're talking about the class name, right? It's like, why can't it just have a class name on it?
You've got a component, and that's the component, you know, and it might do many different things depending upon layout, context, the media situation. And it just needs to be that thing, and that thing can live on its own as an isolated unit. So it's back to that kind of idea, really, of just, you know, sectioning these things out, of being completely agnostic about where they live and what context they live in. Without trying to abstract out. It is the antithesis of OOCSS, what I'm about, because it's like, rather than trying to separate these things and share everything, I want to isolate and contain them all. And that's the fundamental difference, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Now, are you using, so you're using a bit of Sass, are you still abstracting out some of those concepts in Sass? So if you have, say, like a type of header, do you abstract that into a mixin or an extend and then use that throughout all of your components, or are you just writing each one within the component?
I tend to write most of them inside the component. I tend to reserve mixing. I don't use a lot of mixins. I don't use a lot of Sass, or the more complicated stuff. I tend to use mixins, for example, if I've got a fairly complicated font stack, and I want to, you know, I'll be switching between a regular stack, a condensed stack, and a headline stack. I might have a mixin for each one of those. Or similarly, like I do a lot of stuff with like horizontal scrolling panels, like you get on iTunes and the like. And so I've got a mixin that just sets a div to do like white space, no wrap, overflow touch, you know, and all the little MS Microsoft properties when it's on a set. Stuff like that, which I'll never remember off the top of my head. So all I've got to remember is include horizontal scroller, and I'm done. So it tends to be for little things like that. And I'm also like, it's funny on a Sasha, but like I wonder in, you know, a fairly short timeline where I might be off Sass and onto something else. Just because for my own selfish purposes, I recognise that my JavaScript skills are weak. And so the more I can, I'm looking at things like post-CSS and finding those quite interesting at the minute. And so I think there's problems they can solve that perhaps Sass can't, and it also, once you sort of get a grip on those, you can effectively do whatever you need to in JavaScript, that you're waiting for the Sass language to introduce new features, whereas this way around, if you need a feature, you just write it. So there's things like that which I'm kind of teetering on the edge of yet at the minute. Nice.
So, what kind of responses have you had from? I haven't had a chance to look through all the comments. I'm sure there's probably a few on the OCSS. Has there been like some good constructive stuff coming out of it, or is this mostly flame wars?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't too bad. I think, in fairness, I don't have a massive audience, so, you know, I think if it was something like that on CSS Tricks, there'd be quite a bit of vitriol pointed in my direction. But I've had people like say, "Oh, this is nonsense. You know, you don't understand OOCSS," and I've said, "Well, could you enlighten me? You know, like, tell me why. What is it that I'm misunderstanding?" But nobody's actually provided me with any examples, so it's one of those things again. Like, I'm happy to be wrong, you know, if I've got the wrong end of the stick here. But hopefully, I didn't, despite the sort of inflammatory title. Hopefully, I put enough sort of precursors in there to say, oh, look, I'm not saying OOCSS is rubbish. I'm just saying that there's these other things. You know, that's the main thrust of it. So I've had a couple of people say, you know, we do something similar, or we agree. But I've not really had anybody do a response blog post that goes, "You're an idiot and this is why." So there's time yet, of course.
Yeah, well, that's a call out then. Someone out there needs to write a good blog post.
Yes.
No, I think there's some great points out there, and it's kind of fun over the last couple of years seeing everyone starts to converge, especially around kind of the circles, at least I'm in and whatnot. Everyone starts to converge on these same kind of ideas, like we do a lot of Sass, and we try and figure out like how do we organize our Sass, and independently we're all getting to the same point where we're agreeing on what this actual Sass structure looks like. And you know, it hasn't been because of coordination, just because the more you play with it, you get to that point. And I think this whole concept of like, you know, a single class that's associated to something in CSS that you can then add styles to, or in our cases, bring styles in with mix-ins and extends, those kind of things. I think we're all kind of moving towards that and moving away from this really inflexible, I've got these 3 classes on my markup, and those are the styles that are attached to it. And the only way to ever change those is to go and start ripping those out of markup. So yeah, I think a lot of us are kind of getting to that point, and this article certainly kind of embodies the things we've been thinking and maybe been a little too scared to say. So certainly grateful that you had the nerve to go and put that out there and say whatever. If someone's going to say something bad, go for it. Well, then I know that's one of your last article, maybe. So I'm looking forward to what's your next one.
Yeah, it'll probably. I mean, like I say, I'm doing a small project at the minute with Post CSS. I'm trying to do a lot of the things I do with Sass. See if I can do it with Post CSS. So if that goes well, I'll probably write that up, and if it doesn't, you'll hear no more about it.
No, if it doesn't go well, we need to hear that.
Yeah, that's true.
See what you learned.
Yeah.
Can you give us a hint? Like I know, I'm a big fan of with the auto prefixer. I mean, that makes a ton of sense. I mean, you just write what you normally write. Don't even touch it. Don't worry about it. Let the auto prefixer change it to what it needs to be. What other areas are you thinking of making changes?
It's more just like for example, data structures. Like we have maps now in Sass, but for a long time that we didn't. And I'm sort of getting conscious of the fact that I've spent a lot of time learning Sass, the language, and functions and loops and all these sort of new features that come out. But it's not portable, so I can't apply any of that knowledge. I mean, I know some of it's like basic sort of computer sciencey if-else statements. The syntax is different, but they're essentially the same everywhere. But it's more, all that stuff that I'm learning in Sass. I don't do anything in Ruby, so I can't use that anywhere else. So I'm sort of feel like, well, if I spent more time doing something that was all in JavaScript, like my feeling is that JavaScript's not going anywhere. It's not going to get any smaller for a long time. And so if I can, with PostCSS, you have a a gulp file that you can stick it if you want to use gulp, but you can literally just write functions to do stuff to the CSS. So you can pick up the CSS, reference an external JSON file, loop through it, and spit the rules back out into the CSS file. So it's very scary, but very liberating and potentially very empowering, because it means that the only limitations are the limitations of what you can write for yourself in JavaScript. So that's what appeals to me. But the flip side of that is obviously the more you try and onboard other people. Sass has got such good documentation now. It's so robust. You've got to weigh up, whether you go with this entirely bespoke thing, what you actually gaining. So that's why I'm kind of teetering on the edge at the minute. I'm not entirely convinced, but it's very interesting.
Yeah, it really makes sense. I mean, there's tons of value in something like auto prefixer of just offloading that to the back end and letting that take care of it during the build system. I think that's really what it is when we all started with Sass. I mean, I know I did. You had Compass, and that was your build system basically. And we've all started moving over to Grunt and Gulp, and now we have these much more complex build systems that allow us to take this, process it, move it over here, process a little bit more, and we have this repeatable build system that allows us to do something. So it makes a lot of sense to put something at the end to be able to look at your CSS, and whether it's like organizing all of your media queries together or whatever the case, there's a lot of things we can do to optimize that CSS before it gets put out. And then we have testing and those kind of things to make sure that the work we're doing isn't breaking things, which is really good.
Yeah.
So that segues us perfectly into my next point. As two of the pillars,
you're so smooth.
I know. I was like, ooh, testing. I should jump right over to that. Curious if you are in your build process. You definitely. Sounds like you're doing lots with Gulp in your build process. Are you doing much with documentation and testing? Those are kind of the two other areas we talk about a lot here. I'm kind of curious if there's tools that you like or processes that you found that worked for you.
In terms of documentation, at the minute, very sort of lo-fi, old school. Basically, in the project, I have a folder called Docs, and when I want to document something, I just make a markdown file and write it up there. I tend to comment my stuff very heavily anyway, but I've not done, I don't use anything like Sass docs or anything like that at the minute. I'd like to get to a point fairly soon where I'd like the ability to basically sort of build a style guide out of the existing code. What I don't want to be doing is double punching stuff like into two systems, because it's just, I've tried that in the past, and all that happens is things get out of sync, and it's actually more damaging than just not having it at all. So that's something that I'll definitely be looking at in due course. It's just not the biggest problem for me at the minute. And then the other thing that I am interested in is CSS testing, in terms of like visual regressions and the like. And I know on here you've talked about it a couple of times, but the thing that I've been looking at and not actually used yet is a thing called Coyote, which is, rather than what interests me about it is, rather than a visual diffing tool, it lets you like declaratively say, this item needs to display at 30 pixels or 2 rems or whatever. So I find that quite interesting, because it's more akin to sort of JavaScript testing, where this thing needs to return true, and it's like I'm hoping it will be a faster system than visual diffing. But yeah, again, I don't have any great experience in that side of things. It's more just things I want to do and things that I've looked at, as opposed to experience I could share.
No, certainly. No, that sounds interesting. I know when I was first thinking about testing, how do you test CSS? That was one of the first things to think about. Is, well, you can just write tests that go into the page and make sure that the button's blue and that the font size is this and whatnot and whatnot. For me, that just sounded really challenging, because you're basically having to write tests that equal your entire CSS stack.
Yeah.
So of course it's this matter of, well, how much coverage do you do, and what's the process of updating the tests? Because obviously if you change your styles, you also need to update those tests, and like the time, like how much time does it take to do that? But
are you using Phantom at the minute, Micah?
I am using Phantom CSS at the moment.
And how are you finding it?
I am loving it to death, to say the least.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got a couple talk proposals. Actually, one that just got accepted. Don't think I can talk about quite yet, but we're looking forward to be doing really soon. And probably the biggest thing that I like about Phantom CSS is it allows you to do component-based diffing.
Right. Okay.
So it can grab just a selector on the page and say, I just want to diff that from a baseline.
All right. Okay, that's good.
And that solves a lot of the problems of, like, you have a full page of stuff. And then you can also write really smart tests that allow you to, like, well, like for one, I've got a search box that I've just been building, and there's filters on it, and you click on the filter, and then a drop down pops down, and you click on something, and the little like multi-select shows up there, and then there's a clear button. So there's all this interaction with the component. And with Phantom CSS and Casper, I can walk through all of those steps of clicking on this, clicking on that, typing this in, clicking on that, and then taking screenshots of each of those stages. And then every single time I run this test, it just goes back, Phantom.js, spins that page up, clicks the things, does the things, and brings back screenshots that need to match up with my old ones. So
how quick is the process of doing, like when you run the test, how long does it take?
To do that probably takes 10 seconds.
Oh, right,
So,
okay.
yeah,
I was thinking it would be like a minute and a half while you just sort of sat.
Oh, no, yeah, it's super fast. I mean, it's Phantom.js, so it spins up headlessly. There's no Chrome that has to go around it. And really, yeah, it's just a matter of processing. Like I run, we've got a dozen, 24 different components, and you run it, and it might take a minute or something like that. But that's tests. And
you do it at the end anyway, I guess, so it's not a big deal.
It's really something that gets run, like you do your individual tests on your one component while you're building it, and then it's just really when you do that merge request, when it comes in, the test suite runs, and you get a pass or fail a couple minutes later, while you're doing other stuff. And so I know a lot of the behavioral tests can take a good 20, 30 minutes. So if we're just doing a couple minutes on visual regression, I think I'm pretty happy with that.
Yeah.
So,
when you need to document this now, Micah.
I was going to say you should do a Sass Bites run through the way that you did with your grunt stuff and take us through how you do it.
I will definitely do it. I just did PDX Sass a couple weeks ago. I did a demo of it. It went really well. So I'm thinking I might just take that and throw it in a Sass Bites sometime and just kind of show how that process works.
I'll be very interested to see that.
I will be more than happy to show it, because I'm loving it. I wrote a tweet yesterday that I feel like a wizard. I mean, I can go in with Casper and like basically tell the browser what to do and when to take screenshots, and it just works. It's pretty incredible. There's still kinks. A lot of the technology is still new. The older version of Phantom.js is still woefully behind. Like, it doesn't do Flexbox and has issues with some font face stuff, but version 2 is out. Hopefully fixes a lot of that. We just kind of have to wait for it to come down the pipe. But point is to get these tests in place and kind of have that foundation there. So I will definitely do one of those soon as soon as we stop having awesome people to interview. Then I'll do that. So cool. That gets us there. And then Elise, I know you wanted to wrap up with this last item. So feel free to take that one away.
Yeah, I do. So, Ben, we had actually have mentioned you a couple times on the show previously, and so I was super excited to have you on. And I think my biggest question every time I read your stuff is like, you are so prolific. You have been blogging for so long, and you're always coming out with these new, I mean, it's not every day or every week, but fairly consistently with new posts and new content, and they're always so good and so well thought out. And like your Enduring CSS one is obviously, I mean, it's practically a small book of a blog post.
Editor. I mean,
yeah, it's crazy. How do you stay so prolific? How do you get writing and blogging into your daily or weekly workflow and force yourself to do that? I struggle very much with sitting down and doing that kind of thing.
Well, firstly, thank you very much. You're very kind to say so. I think for me, there's a couple of things. As I get older, I tend to forget stuff. So part of it is, again, it's sort of selfish reasons that when I've been through a situation and I've learned something, I'm very keen to document that so that in 6 months' time, when I'm second guessing myself about something, I have a reference to go back to and go, oh yeah, that's why I ended up at that point, and I don't have to go through the journey again. And then I think the other thing was I can always remember, I've never been very good at maths, and so I can always remember trying to solve problems, and my dad, who was an engineer in the real world, he used to say to me, look, whenever you start a problem, just write down what you know. That should always be your starting point, and just by writing down what you know, you're already at a point further along than you were before, and that's always sort of resonated with me. So that's usually where, like, often I'll start a blog post, it's like the beginning of a problem, and I don't necessarily know what the conclusion is, but it motivates me to then carry on through and figure this stuff out. So it's funny, like, because obviously I've got 2 books out now, and people will assume that just because I've got a book about responsive web design, which was like the second book about responsive web design that came out, and then the Sass and Compass book, and people think I hold all that stuff in my head, which you don't. That's why I write it. I write it down once I figure this stuff out, so I have a reference for myself as well. And I think a lot of our challenge, or rather the problems that we face, it's not about knowing the exact syntax at that point in time or exactly how you will do that thing. It's more about having a good broad idea of what can be solved and how it can be solved, not necessarily knowing, it's like the equivalent of knowing exactly which size screw and fitting to put something on the wall. You just need to know that with a screw and a fitting, you can fix the thing to the wall. So a lot of the writing is just like a personal journal, I suppose.
Well, it's kind of like the same reason we document our code and document the things we write, and like we come to this conclusion, build this thing. You document your life, you document the things you're learning, you document the things that you're going through. And I know for us in a project, there's huge value in documenting these things. So it makes just as much sense that there's tons of value in documenting the things that are happening within your professional journey.
I think as well. I mean, one more thing I would say is that, like, I take a lot from the internet. There's so many things that people make that make me able to do my job, and a lot of the time I'm not a big contributor of code to places like GitHub. I'm not able to give back that way. But if I can document something that solves a problem for somebody or helps them solve it, I feel like that's me giving a little bit of something back.
I think you've definitely done that. So keep it up, and looking forward to reading it. Well, awesome, Ben. I know we have taken up plenty of your precious time, so I want to say thank you for coming on Sass Bites this week. Honestly, this has been an amazing series because I've had some of probably my biggest heroes or people I've looked up to, and people I've enjoyed reading for such a long time come on the show, and some of the future guests. Like, it's still there's more coming down the pipe. I'm excited to have a vehicle that I have a chance to talk to these people and hopefully get some of these messages out to other people as well. As you said, like I do some contributing of code, but I can do this. Like, this is something I can do, that I'm good at, and I really hope it benefits. And, I hear from people that it benefits them. So I appreciate you coming on and being willing to share that time with us and that knowledge. So
not at all. Thank you.
So just a quick bit about you, so people can buy your books.
They can, yeah. I'm working on the second edition of the responsive one at the minute, so that should be out in sort of 2 or 3 months' time. So it's got all the sort of latest hotness, Flexbox, SVG, all that sort of stuff in it. So yeah, it's my own personal catalogue of how to do things.
So your reference guide.
Yeah.
And then Sass and Compass for Designers is the other one, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Excellent. So you guys can go out there and buy that. I won't even give you a link so I make money. Just go get it, because Ben is awesome and you'll love reading his stuff. So thanks again, Ben, for coming on this week, for Elise, for being able to come from your awesome living room. Your connection is great over there, apparently.
Maybe I should do it from my home more often instead of work.
It seems to go quite well, and it's amazing the connection between like here, Austin, and UK, and it feels like one room. So
yeah,
thank you, Google.
It's really good, isn't it? I haven't had any lag or anything. I'm as impressed as you are.
Well, I've been doing this for 69 shows, and it's been going. I've probably had like 2 foibles the entire time. It's been really amazing. So next week, it's gonna keep getting better. Gina Bolton's gonna be coming on next week and talk about some of the work she's doing recently. We had her on several months ago when we were doing Road to SassConf, as well as Women in Sass. Yeah, with you, exactly. So I'm excited to have her come back on and talk about the work that she's doing right now, because she keeps doing awesome stuff. So that's going to be great, and we've got a few more guests lined up as we keep going. So it's going to be a ton of fun. Stick around. Next week, we are going to be doing it on Wednesday. So if you're here on Thursday, sorry we missed you, but it will be recorded. So you can always get that at youtube.com/sassbites. And as well, we're working on a real very lean, mean site at the moment of SassBites. That's SASBIT.ES. One of those cool ES people, I guess. You can go check that out. It's basically just an RSS feed that's pulling stuff in. It's occasionally behind, but we're working on it. Hopefully it'll look prettier in the future, and we'll keep going on that. So thanks again, everyone, for coming on. Thanks, listeners, for watching, and we will catch you next week on SassBites. Later.
Bye.